Okay, everyone, this is the video lecture for Chapter 13 on meiosis and sexual life cycles. Probably going to divide this video lecture into two parts. The first part will cover basically sexual and asexual life cycles and concepts of heredity. And then in the second half, we'll get into what's actually going on in a special kind of cell division called meiosis. Okay, so we know that living organisms are distinguished by their ability to reproduce their own kind. That's what we refer to as the continuity of life. Heredity is the transmission of traits from one generation to the next, and that is essentially the primary goal, so to speak, of reproduction, is to pass genetic information from the current generation into the next generation, and heredity is the way that happens. All right. Now, even though we are passing along our genetic information to our offspring, or we got ours from our parents in turn, each generation shows a large amount of variation compared to the generation before and the generation that comes after. No two individuals in a sexually reproducing population are alike. Okay, and we'll see what that means here in just a little bit. But variation is key. Variation allows for individuals in a population to be different, and that's what allows natural selection to operate, one of the primary forces that drives evolutionary change. It selects in any given generation, any given moment, the individuals in a population that are better suited to their environment, and they generally survive better, reproduce more, or produce more offspring more successfully, and so on. All right, so variation is key. What we're going to see in the type of cell division we call meiosis is that it produces an astounding amount of variation. All right. Okay. Finally, genetics. Genetics is the scientific study of heredity and variation, and that's actually the topic of Chapter 14, which comes next. There's a good reason why we always talk about meiosis right before the genetics chapter, and that's because the patterns of heredity that we see in genetics can all be traced back to what's going on in meiosis and sexual life cycles. Okay, so take a look at this sort of mixed race family here. So a couple of things stand out. First of all, obviously, these three children are descended from these two parents, okay? Now, one parent is African American, one is Caucasian, and so what we see then in their children is a nice mixture of both African and European traits or characters, okay? And the reason why these kids seem to be a nice mixture of both of their parents' features is because of what's going on in meiosis and because of the patterns of heredity that are explained by meiosis and genetics. All right. So in a literal sense, children do not inherit particular physical traits from their parents. It's genes that are actually inherited. So genes are segments or fragments of DNA that we pass from one generation to the next. You can sort of think of each generation of organisms as temporary repositories for genes that they got from their parents and that they will eventually pass on to their offspring. All right. So we're talking about the gene here, right? The gene. For our purposes, let's make it simple. Let's think about a gene as a segment of DNA that codes for a trait. All right. Now, they're actually more complicated than that, but that's all that we need to really consider them as at this point in time. So we know the genes are passed to the next generation via reproductive cells called gametes. All right. Excuse me. Gametes. Gametes are reproductive cells, and here we're talking about eggs and sperm cells. Okay, eggs and sperm. So these are gametes, and they are quite unique in a lot of respects compared to other cells of the body that don't play a role in our reproduction, and we'll see some more about that a little bit later on. Okay, now most of the DNA in our cells is packaged as chromosomes. And we saw that in the last chapter on mitosis, right? We talked about chromosomes moving, being arranged and moving to opposite sides of the cell so the cell can divide into between them. So chromosomes are really large pieces of DNA, and each chromosome contains a number of genes, and it varies. The number varies. It could be a few hundred to a few thousand genes on a chromosome. It just depends. Now, Humans have a total of 46 chromosomes, okay, in our somatic cells. So somatic cells are non-reproductive cells. So here we're talking about all the cells of our body other than eggs and sperm. So skin cells, muscle cells, bone cells, nerve cells, for example. Okay, these are somatic cells or body cells as we call them. All right. Now, that in humans, somatic cells have 46 chromosomes. Okay, that is not true in eggs and sperm. In humans, each egg has 23 chromosomes, as does each sperm. So eggs and sperm have half the total number of chromosomes that somatic cells do. Okay, and that's one thing that meiosis does. It actually cuts chromosome number in half. We refer to meiosis as reduction division. Okay, reduction division because it cuts chromosome number in half. We'll see why that is in a little bit. Now, going back to the chromosome, I mentioned that there might be a few hundred to a few thousand genes on a chromosome, depending on which chromosome we're talking about. The exact location on a chromosome where you find a gene is called its locus. So just think of the locus as like the physical address, if you will, right? The mailing address. This is where you find a particular gene. So if we're talking about, let's say, a gene that codes for, I don't know, eye color, let's say, and you identify that one gene in humans, in every human on the planet, that gene is in exactly the same spot on exactly the same chromosome. That spot is its locus. All right. Now, let's talk about, let me erase some of this here real quick. Oops, sorry. Let me erase some of this. Let's talk about different modes of reproduction here, okay? We're going to see in a little bit that meiosis is a critical aspect of what we refer to as sexual reproduction. But we also have a type of reproduction referred to as asexual, okay? So asexual reproduction. So, as the name suggests, this is reproduction without sex. Now, when I say the word sex, I'm not meaning that word in the same context that you probably think I'm meaning it. The biological definition of sex is the recombination of DNA from two distinct individuals into one. So, both parents in a sexually reproducing species contribute DNA, usually in the form of the egg and the sperm, to their offspring. So your mother's DNA and your father's DNA recombine in the offspring, and that is the biological definition of sex, okay? Not the act of sex necessarily. Now, in asexual reproduction, you don't have recombination of DNA from two distinct sources into the offspring. The offspring gets its DNA from one parent alone. So there's one parent solely that contributes 100% of the offspring's DNA to it. That is asexual reproduction. So, since that offspring is getting all of its DNA from one parent, that offspring is referred to as a clone. It is a genetic clone. It is genetically identical to the parent that it came from because 100% of its DNA came from that one parent. All right? Now, in sexual reproduction, that is not true. In sexual reproduction, you have DNA from two distinct parents recombining into unique combinations in the offspring. So the offspring has 50% of its DNA from one parent and 50% from the other parent. And this produces an astounding amount of genetic variation. All right. So there are, if you look at most at species across the planet, whether they're animal, plant, fungi, protist, whatever, sexual reproduction is the norm. Okay, the vast majority of species reproduce sexually. The reason for that, again, is because it produces genetic variation. Think about an asexual population of clones. They're all derived from the same parent. They're all genetically identical, let's say. Let's say that a new virus is introduced into that population. And if it kills one of them, that means that one had no immunity to it. And because that one is genetically identical to all the rest, none of the others have any immunity to it either. So if it kills one, it might well kill them all and wipe out the entire population. But in a sexually reproducing species where every individual is genetically unique from all the others, there are going to be some individuals that by chance alone are more resistant to that virus or possibly even entirely immune. So the virus may wipe out 95% of the population, but a small percentage will invariably survive, and they're the ones that will reproduce the next generation and give their good, virus immune genes to their offspring. And so the next generation, the entire population might well be immune to that virus. The point here is that sexual species, because of their genetic variation, are or tend to persist longer as a species throughout Earth history because they can adapt their environment. They have different genetic tools in their toolbox through variation that they can use to adapt to changing conditions that asexual species simply do not. But let's look at some examples of asexual species. So here on the left, we have a species called a hydra. Now, this is a freshwater organism. It's about a millimeter or so in length, very, very small. Very closely related to marine corals, sea anemones, and jellyfishes, okay? But what you see here is the parent organism, and you see a bud growing off the side. That bud is a new offspring. So the cell division that's making this individual is mitosis. It's what we talked about in chapter 12, and we talked about how mitosis produces cells that are genetically identical to the cells that they came from, didn't we? That means that this bud, once it gets a little bit older, or more mature, it breaks off the parent and it will develop into a brand new identical clone of the parent. All right. A lot of plants reproduce asexually. Redwood trees are a good example. What you see here in the middle here is the dead, decaying trunk of the original parent. And in this sort of cylindrical pattern around that, you see asexual clones of that parent. So maybe that tree fell over in a windstorm before it died. There were rhizomes underneath the soil that sort of moved out or grew out from that trunk, the root system, and developed into brand new identical individuals, all identical to each other and all identical to that original parent. So one of the benefits then of asexual reproduction is that it is very, very, very quick, and it allows for production of a large number of offspring in a short amount of time, because two parents don't have to find each other, go through courting rituals, that sort of thing. One parent just produces a new offspring, and it happens very quickly. The downside, again, is the lack of genetic variation that we talked about. Okay, let's talk next about what are called life cycles. So a life cycle is the generation-to-generation sequence of stages in the reproductive history of an organism. It's all of the events that an organism goes through from the time it's born, hatched, or whatever until it begins to reproduce, okay? Once an organism has reproduced for the last time during its lifespan, its life cycle is considered to be over. It may continue to live for some time, think humans, for example, but its life cycle, which refers to the reproductive aspects of its life, is now over, okay? So again, life cycle is simply the generation-to-generation sequence of stages in the reproductive history of an organism. All right, so when you look at animals by and large have very similar life cycles. Certainly all mammals have very similar life cycles. When you compare mammals to amphibians, for example, you start to see more differences. When you compare animals, however, as a large group to plants, you really see some distinct differences there. But within animals, you generally see the same sorts of stages that are encountered during the life cycle. All right. So let's define a few things before we get into talking more about life cycles. So we said that humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, or more specifically, earlier I said 46 chromosomes. Well, 46 times 2, 23 times 2 is 46, correct? So either way you say it is fine. Humans have 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs. We can actually display those. We can take those out of the nucleus of a cell and display them and look for any sort of anomalies. That display that we look at is called a karyotype. Okay, a karyotype. It's an ordered display of the pairs of chromosomes in a cell. We can do it for humans, other species, whatever. Very often in humans, the reason it's done is to look for any sort of chromosomal anomalies, maybe in an embryo or a fetus, while still in the womb, looking to see if there are extra chromosomes or missing chromosomes that might result in some genetic disorder, like, for example, Down syndrome. All right, now, when we look at a karyotype, what we see is that each chromosome consists of two copies, okay? So each pair of chromosomes consists of two copies, and we call those chromosomes of each pair homologous. Homologous means they have the same information on them. Sometimes you also see them referred to as homologs, okay? They have the same information. So for example, chromosome number 7 in you have two copies of it, one from your mother and one from your father. And those two copies of that same chromosome, one from each of your parents, have the exact same sets of genes on them, okay? So that's why they're homologous. Now, chromosome number 7 and number 12, they have different sets of genes. They are not homologous, okay? Two copies of number 12, one from your mother, one from your father. Again, same sets of genes. They're homologous, all right? So chromosomes in a homologous pair are the same length, same shape, and they carry genes controlling the same inherited characters. And that's what you see here in this karyotype. So first of all, over here on the right, this is a karyotype, okay? And you see this is from a human. There's chromosome pair number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, all the way down to number 23 right here, which in humans are the sex chromosomes. So these chromosomes came from a male. We know that because there's an X chromosome and a Y chromosome right there. XY, that's male. Okay, but let's take a look at this chromosome pair here. What we're seeing here is two distinct chromosomes, right? So that's chromosome number 1. Let's say it came from this individual's mother, and this is chromosome number 1 that came from this individual's father. Look at the banding pattern, right? They're duplicates, aren't they? You can tell from the banding pattern, which identifies different gene regions of a chromosome, that they're the same. This is how they line them up under a microscope. They look for the same banding patterns. All right. Now, one thing about this is showing you two members of a homologous pair after DNA replication. Okay, so this is going to get us into something that very often confuses students. For one thing, as meiosis progresses, it cuts chromosome number in half. I mentioned before that sperm and egg, which are the product of meiosis, have half the number of chromosomes that a somatic cell, like a skin cell or a muscle cell, do. All right? That's what we call meiosis reduction division. The reason for that is because if a sperm is going to fertilize an egg, you don't want a human sperm having 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, and fertilizing an egg with 23 chromosomes or 46 pairs. That would give you 92 chromosomes in the embryo. That's way too many. That's twice as many. That embryo would not survive. So meiosis cuts chromosome number in half in the sperm and the egg, 23 singles in each. When they fuse during fertilization, 23 plus 23 gives you 46 in the embryo. So meiosis, the reduction division part, is what keeps chromosome number constant from one generation to the next. Okay, but what you're seeing here is one aspect of this. So if you look at this homologous pair, right, you're seeing one on the left with the centromere in the middle. There's a centromere. Oops, sorry. I get my pointer to work. There's the centromere in the middle, okay? And you have one chromatin on the left, one on the right. So maybe that's the mother's chromosome. That's a replicated chromosome. You have for the father's, same thing, right? A replicated chromosome. So replicated because this chromosome has two sister chromatids, one there and one there, attached to a common centromere. Same thing here. Two sister chromatids attached to a common centromere. So in this pair then, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 chromatids. That's what you see here. Two chromatids identical to each other in the mother's chromosome, two chromatids identical to each other in the father's chromosome. Okay. Now, one more point. These will have the same genes on them, but it doesn't mean that these genes on the mother's chromosome and these on the father will be the same versions. We can have different versions of genes. So if we have a gene for eye color here, for example, you might have one that codes for I don't know, brown eyes here and one that codes for green here. The gene codes for eye color. That's what I mean by them being the same genes, but the versions of them could be different, coding for different traits, which are different eye colors, okay? All right. So, next thing, again, talk about it, the sex chromosomes. I mentioned that briefly before. Here's the sex chromosomes in humans. It's pair number 23. So males have an X and a Y. That's how you know those chromosomes and that karyotype came from a male. If this were a female, you'd have a second X right there, XX. That means that in humans anyway, and this isn't always true of other species, but in humans anyway, the father is the one that actually determines the sex of the offspring, because a female having two X's can only contribute X chromosomes to her eggs. Every egg will have a single X chromosome. The father, half of his sperm carry the X, the other half carry the Y. So if an X sperm fertilizes an X egg, you get a female or a daughter. If a Y sperm fertilizes an X egg, you get a male or a son. All right. So pair number 23 in humans are sex chromosomes. What do we call pairs 1 through 22? They are called autosomes. All right. They're not sex chromosomes. They're called autosomes because they have genes that play no role in determining the sex of the offspring, whereas the sex chromosomes do. All right. So another important definition here that relates to this chromosome number. So remember I said that somatic cells have, in humans, 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs, okay? All right, we talk about a cell in humans or any species that has two copies of every chromosome. The term for that is diploid. So a diploid cell has two copies of each chromosome. Okay, so in humans, we're talking about somatic cells, right? So every cell in your body, except for a sperm or an egg, depending on your sex, is a somatic cell, and it's diploid. It has two copies of every chromosome. Now, gametes, sperm and egg, they are what we call haploid, having 1/2 the number of chromosomes, okay? So a sperm in humans would be 23 chromosomes, an egg 23, a skin cell 46, all right? So diploid, how do we define that? We refer to that as 2n. So diploid is 2n, haploid is simply n, all right? So the diploid number in humans, 2n equals 46, haploid number in humans, n equals 23. All right, now as I said, in a cell in which DNA synthesis has occurred, so after S phase of the cell cycle of interphase, each chromosome is replicated, right? So here you have, let's just do it this way. Here you have a non-replicated chromosome, right? You have your centromere right there in the center, and you have a single chromatid attached to that centromere. That's a non-replicated chromosome. That's what it would look like prior to S phase of interphase. Now, after S phase, what does it look like? Oops, sorry, go back. After S phase, it looks like this. All right, that's a really poor drawing, but that is now a duplicated chromosome or a replicated chromosome. One chromatid on the right, one on the left. These two will be identical to each other, okay? Identical sister chromatids, as they're called, sister chromatids. Let me write that down. Same thing we saw in the chapter on mitosis, last chapter. All right, let's look at a figure. So this is a figure that shows you what I'm talking about here. Now, they've shown a hypothetical cell here with a diploid number of 6 that you see right there, okay? The red shows the maternal set of chromosomes. There are 3 of those. The blue, the paternal set, 3 of those. So we have your father's chromosome, number 1, number 2, and number 3, let's say. Mother's chromosome, number 1, number 2, number 3, all right? Notice that each of them is replicated. So we have a single centromere here with 2 identical chromatids attached to it. Same is true for all of these others. All right, how many chromosomes then do we have in this cell? Sometimes students will say 6. Sometimes they'll say 12. 12 is wrong. It's 6. So how do you determine chromosome number? It's simple. You count the centromeres. There's 1 centromere, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. the number of centromeres equals the number of chromosomes. All right? Don't get confused by number of chromatids. Okay? Chromatids, two chromatids attached to the same centromere equal one chromosome, a duplicated chromosome, right? So again, non-replicated chromosome, replicated chromosome. Both of those are one chromosome. All right, how do you know? Each one has a single centromere. So don't get confused by number of chromatids. One chromosome, one chromosome. Non-replicated, replicated. All right. So in this hypothetical cell here, we have a diploid number of 6. Haploid number, if the cell went through meiosis and produced sperm or egg, haploid number then would be 3. All right. Okay. So we've said that a gamete, sperm or egg, contains a single set of chromosomes. We call that haploid, or just N. For humans, the haploid number is N equals 23. Each set of 23 chromosomes then consists of 22 autosomes, like I said, and a single sex chromosome, either an X or a Y. Okay, if it's the father, then half the sperm are X, half are Y. If it's the mother, all the eggs are X. In an unfertilized egg, the sex chromosome is X again. Okay, all right. So at fertilization, what happens is that the 23 chromosomes from the human sperm join with the 23 chromosomes from the human egg, and you go back to the diploid number. That embryo, or that fertilized egg as it's called, is diploid, right? So what is a fertilized egg? What's the name for it? Zygote. And the zygote is always 2N, all right? The zygote is what you get when a sperm fertilizes an egg, just before it begins to divide. Once it begins to divide, we no longer call it a zygote, but an embryo. All right. Then it continues to divide through mitosis. All the cell division that occurs from that point on is mitosis, like we saw in the last chapter. That will eventually produce a fetus, then an infant, which continues to grow into a juvenile, and finally to an adult through mitosis. Mitosis is responsible for development. Meiosis, that we're talking about in this chapter, just produces sperm and egg. That's it. All right. So, as I said, fertilization is the union of gametes, okay, the sperm and the egg. Fertilized egg is called a zygote. That zygote then goes on to divide. So it splits into 2 cells, then we call it an embryo. Those 2 cells split into 4, 4 into 8, 8 into 16, and you get geometric growth from that point on. That eventually produces the entire organism, okay? But all that cell division from the point on of, or from after fertilization, is mitosis. All right, so when does meiosis kick in again? At sexual maturity, and that depends. When that occurs depends on the species you're talking about. In humans, it's puberty, right? So anywhere from 11 to 13, something like that, it kicks in. That's the point at which males and females can make gametes. Now, one clarification about that in humans. In humans, human females have already gone through the first part of meiosis by the time they're born, okay? So they've already got the first part of meiosis pretty much done, and their ovaries are sort of preloaded with anywhere from 200,000 to 400,000 precursor cells. They've already completed the first stages of meiosis. Then they go into basically suspended animation for the next 11, 12, 13 years after birth. Then, when that human female begins her estrous cycle and hits puberty, once a month, one of those cells then completes meiosis and becomes an egg, an ovum. That would then have a chance of being fertilized, okay? In human males, that doesn't happen. In human males, meiosis does not start until puberty, so 11, 12, 13. Human males have no cells that can be regarded as precursors to sperm or anything like that until they reach puberty, and then they start producing millions of sperm per day at that point, and continue to do so, or can continue to do so well into their 80s, or even older in some cases. All right, so meiosis is the process then that produces these gametes, okay? So when we look at a sexual life cycle, which I'm going to show you here in a minute, you're going to see that there are 2 halves of the cycle. The two halves of the cycle are divided by fertilization on one side and meiosis on the other. So fertilization and meiosis alternate in sexual life cycles to maintain chromosome number. All right, this is the human life cycle. Now, we are all intimately familiar with this life cycle because this is how we reproduce, okay? Now, let's start with two adult or sexually mature humans, female and male, okay? And by the way, when we use the word adult or mature in the biological context, it means capable of producing gametes. So biologically, humans are mature adults at age 12, 13, something like that, when they can first produce gametes. That's different than the legal definition, obviously, which is 18, okay? All right, so two sexually mature humans, female and male. In the ovaries of the female, meiosis is going to produce eggs, all right? In the testes of the male, meiosis produces sperm. So notice that everything below on the bottom half, between underneath meiosis and fertilization, which are color coding, those are diploid stages of our life cycle, okay? So clearly adults are diploid, eggs are diploid, okay? Meiosis takes the diploid stage and converts it into two haploid stages, egg and sperm, right? So 23 single chromosomes here, 23 here, 23 pairs of chromosomes in each of these adults in all their cells, except for their gametes. All right. At fertilization, egg and sperm fuse, and you get 23 in the sperm plus 23 in the egg, 46 in the zygote. That takes us back then into the diploid stage. That zygote then develops through mitosis, right, into adult sexually mature organisms. At that point, their ovaries and testes begin to produce, through meiosis, gametes again, and the process starts over. So this is a key feature of sexually reproducing organisms and their life cycles, is that the diploid stage is typically separated from the haploid stage by meiosis and fertilization. All right, so there are a variety of different sexual life cycles. There's a lot of variation in this, especially when you compare mammals to, say, fish or amphibians, that kind of thing. There are some crazy ways to reproduce out there with a lot of other vertebrate species and also with the invertebrates. But generally speaking, the alternation of meiosis and fertilization is common to all organisms that reproduce sexually, okay? Gametes are the only haploid cells in animals. They're produced by meiosis and undergo no further cell division before fertilization. Gametes confuse to form a diploid zygote, as I've said, at fertilization, that divides by mitosis to develop into a multicellular organism. So here we have a more, I guess I removed that one. There's a more general version of this life cycle, which I was showing you for a mouse, for example, but basically you can apply the same thing on other mammal life cycles to this one. They're all the same, basically. Just put two mice down here instead of two humans, and it's the same. So this is a pretty common way for organisms to reproduce, okay? All right, so I think we're going to stop there, and we'll pick up with the mechanics of what's going on in meiosis with the next video lecture.